Look, working on the assumption that Air Vice Marshal Chiplin will probably have to get back to some reasonably important tasks, we'll start off with Rob. Two questions that immediately spring to my mind, Rob, just very, very quickly. Having had something to do with the recent amendments to the law and the public hysteria that caused the Senate committee to actually do a study of them. Do you think Defence is explaining these recent changes to Army Reserve call-outs well enough? Or do we need to do more to stop people in the community thinking it's the harbinger of martial law and dictatorship? And the second thing is whilst the JTF 629 structure based on Headquarters 2 Div and on the one-star appointments in the States is working well, there are still some problems in that the supporting staff to those one stars isn't the same as it was, say, in the days back when we had military districts that were large and worked with state governments on a daily basis and on some scale anyway. And are we perhaps over relying too much on the Army Reserve to supply that local knowledge? They're two quick questions if you want to tackle them. And I have a third one. Certainly the feedback the Defence Association gets is that whilst JTF 629 is running the operations well, the administration of people deployed on civil support tasks isn't good because it's still done by parent units and it's often up to 12 months behind before people are getting their allowances for deployments. Over to you, Rob.
Terrific. Thanks, Neil. I knew to expect a couple of challenging questions there. I guess by way of public perceptions, my view personally is that it's not our role in Defence to be selling changes to the domestic law, although obviously it affects us. But my observation is also that there's a broad scale of responses to the ADF contributing into the civil community. We see at one end of the spectrum concerns that we are turning in, as you say, to a martial state, but at the other end of the spectrum, we're not doing enough and we're not there early enough, we're not deployed flexibly enough, and there's far more we should be doing. My view is that there's a bell curve here, Neil, that the vast majority of Australians support very strongly the ADF. They recognise that the ADF's in a supporting role to state and territory authorities, and that we just have to accept that there will be extremes of view at both ends of the spectrum, and unfortunately they at times can absorb the bandwidth of our media, but that is not the view of the majority of Australians. By relation to 629, those sort of perceptions that you've raised there aren't familiar to me, so perhaps I best defer those, except to say I still am strongly of the view that that the idea of having the Army Reserve work structure that is there, long-term, permanent, and establishing strong relationships is adding enormous value to our responsiveness to domestic crises. And so whilst there might be ways in which we can improve that, the fundamental model is right. And so it's fine-tuning rather than abolishing and starting with something different.
And the last question, Rob, on the fact that all the people deployed on the civil support tasks, whilst the operations are running well, the administration of the personnel continues to have problems.
Yeah, and as I said, Neil, I just have no awareness of that. That is not an issue that I'm familiar with, and I'd just be guessing with a response if I tried to address that.
No worries. Well, if we can move on to the question up on the screen, which I don't know whether you can see. The AUSMAT team,
yeah.
The state-based reservists. Do you want to tackle that one, please?
So we do have a problem drawing on our medical workforce. We understand that AUSMAT teams are, we have these professionals that are working in the domestic environment. They are supporting AUSMAT teams, and then many of them are part of the reserves. And we're conscious that if we task them as a defence reservist, then that takes them away from their AUSMAT duties. All I can say is that is not new to me. That is a known issue. And when we are talking with DFAT in particular, that employ these OSMAT teams into regional crisis response, then that is an issue that is actively managed. Now, I'm not going to say it's perfect all the time, but DFAT are very conscious that if we draw on that limited resource for defence purposes, then it's unavailable for OSMAT, and that might be where they get better bang for buck.
Yeah, we saw a similar problem, in fact, when the epidemic first started, and social media and the newspapers were full of letters demanding to know why all the ADF's medics weren't supplementing the civil hospitals. And, the knowledge in the community that in surgery, for example, most of the defence's capacity comes from reservists is just not well known. And it certainly became a major problem at the beginning of the emergency.
Yeah, it continues, Neil, if I can, it continues to be a problem. We get asked frequently for medical staff, clinically qualified staff to be able to provide support to vaccination hubs and contact tracing at the moment with COVID-19. It's not understood that defence medical workforce is less than 1% of Australia's total medical workforce, and that there's enormous capacity, there's far more capacity within our domestic system already.
You're exactly right, and it's like all the stupid ideas where they keep saying that why aren't all the defence barracks and bases all over the country being used as quarantine centres, even though they're totally unsuited to the role. I mean, the wider problem is the general public of Australia just honestly don't understand how the Defence Force is configured and how it's based. If I could turn to Michael's presentation with a quick question. There was an old saying that came out of the Falklands War about how the British didn't learn a whole lot of new lessons; they relearned a whole lot of old ones. And it seems that on the total mobilisation side, we're really just going over a lot of old ground in many ways. And I wonder how much your staff are getting input from, for example, the Official History Unit and the history units of the three services on many of the things that we've done before and we're now starting to do again. Have we lost Michael, have we?
Yeah, no, thanks, Neil, for the question. Very relevant, and I think we probably also sometimes slip into relearning lessons, but it is certainly something we're very aware of. One of the very first reports which was commissioned was to review the historical mobilisation processes that we'd employed in the past, and going all the way back to looking at what the old style war book looked like, which was developed during and directly after World War II based on lessons from World War II. And that's sitting on my shelf right now, and it's hundreds of pages thick. The official history units, we are engaged with them, and specifically the Army one, for example, their conference at the end of this year is on mobilisation. So we are already engaging with the organisers of that event. My team will participate, we'll actually present. So we are definitely trying to learn all the relevant lessons and use them as a solid basis to influence our thinking. And it's one of the reasons why we're looked at what other countries are doing. We're not just limiting it on our own perspectives. That's why we commissioned the RAND study to look at 5 different countries. And that's why we're using academic institutions and think tanks across the country to make sure that we cast our net wide to learn as much as we can. And I'd actually characterise our present position in the process is we've done the exploring, we've done the initial research, and now we're transferring that into new ideas and concept, which is why we've started off as a concept as our major deliverable, which should be quite rightly based on the ideas we've managed to pull, new ideas and ideas from the past or actions from the past.
Yeah, I commend the Commonwealth War Book to you. The last edition was 1958. In fact, it was well after the war, and they gave up writing it because it got too difficult rather than whether we actually needed it or not. The other great historical lesson is the Air Force, which increased from 2,800 people to 200,000 within a very short period in World War II. And there are enormous lessons from how that was done. If we could move on to the next question. There's one there on workforce modelling from Brendan Casey. That probably falls within your area, Mike. Can you read it?
Yes, yeah. So does the workforce modelling suggest that our current approach of CIRCAT 5 support domestic operations is long-term sustainable? These are a factor in our thinking. I'm not in the position to rule things in or out at the moment. So it is a challenge. Our remit is wide. We have to come up with a plan which supports internal domestic operations and supports other operations and supports concurrent operations in diverse places. So the CIRCAT 5 ability of our reservists is an important consideration. And then one of the critical factors I mentioned was personnel. So we have an entire area that we're exploring in terms of our depth and our capacity and our scalability and the skills that we need to do that. And in a holistic sense, for some of these domestic operations, it's how we fit in with other agencies. There might be other agencies which are better at providing human resources, and we might be better at providing them support through other options, such as logistics. So we're looking at all these things.
If you haven't seen it, just this week on the Army's Cove website, there's an article by a young lieutenant arguing that we're not looking at this correctly because we're not looking at it in terms of how national workforce laws work. And his basic argument is the reservists on several CIRCATs aren't actually part-timers, they're casuals. And it needs to be linked into how the rest of the country's economy is organised in terms of part-time and casual employment. If you haven't read the short little essay, it's actually an interesting one.
Thanks, Neil. I'll note that and get my team to look at it. I must admit I haven't read it. But when we did put out a call for submissions to influence the concept, it was quite encouraging to see so many of our junior officers and our enlisted ranks provide us their feedback. So we have an engaged audience and they want to contribute, which is good.
If we could go to the next question on the slide, what are your views on MEC's information and public affairs and its role in synchronising national authority or responses in the media? Again, I think that's probably you, Michael. But if Rob wants to chip in, feel free.
Yeah, I might actually ask the Air Vice Marshal to start on that one because
I thought you might do that.
Yeah. I was delighted when you asked Mick to answer that one, Neil, but I guess my question is by what performance measure? My view as an organisation is that they've got an incredibly challenging task to be able to, defence is a huge portfolio, and to be able to take requests from journalists or from government departments that vary from something's gone wrong on a major acquisition project to something's gone wrong on a domestic operation and have responses turned around to meet the media cycle is incredibly challenging. And I reckon they get it right 95% of the time and do an outstanding job. The 5% hurts. It'd be nice to get to 100%, but I think we should be a little bit more risk tolerant when we get to that last 5% with our messaging, because it is difficult to be perfect all the time. And
it would be good to do it faster for the simple reason that the Defence Association, we can get so many stupid questions from journalists because no one in Defence is capable of answering them swiftly. The next question is to do with STEM skills from Peter Alchemade. Has Defence considered specific approaches to major employers of STEM skills to identify any limitations to the ability to surge newer technologies in the ADF?
Again, this is outside my lane. Can I recommend, Peter, that Natasha Fox will be a perfect person to put that question to. She's put a lot of effort into understanding doing market research to understand where the skills are in the Australian community and how we can attract a workforce that meets our future needs. So can I recommend we'll give you an opinion on this, but if you want an authoritative answer, then that's one from Natasha Fox.
Yeah, that's probably fair, but Brendan O'Connor talked about cyber recruitment, and if I had $1 for every defence conference I've attended over the last 15 years, where different people in the ADF have said we need to recruit more fat hackers living in basements to help us on the IT side, so therefore we have to vary perhaps the entry standards for the Defence Reserves, and it never ever moves forward. Has any thought been going into this seriously? Rather than it just being a bright light bulb idea, that there are people out there with IT skills who wouldn't meet normal Defence Reserve medical standards, and maybe we should vary them. Has this ever progressed forward?
Neil, I think there are parts of our organisation, not just ADF personnel, but parts of the defence organisation that employ very flexible standards to take advantage of the skills, the workers' skills, rather than necessarily any kind of generic employment standards that we might have for the broader workforce. So I think, yes, there is flexibility already. Can it be better? The answer to that will be, of course. But I don't. This is not the biggest crocodile to the boat for me personally. Like I look at I've got kids that are getting towards the end of their teenage years, and they are so connected and wired in with technology. But if they come into defence, then they don't have access to that same technology to communicate and get on with business. And so it might be the case that we can achieve things with fat hackers in basements. Yes, that's true. But there are other things that we need to do as an employer of people with STEM skills and modern STEM skills that we need to address as well.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have used the fat hacker in the basement. It's more, as ASD is now doing, finding people who would not normally meet Defence Force medical standards, but are very talented, and people on the autistic spectrum, for example. Although you could argue we have had autistic senior officers over the years. Just joking. If I could quickly move on to a final question for both of you, because we don't seem to have too many up on the slide at the moment, and that's the simple question of contracting out defence recruiting. If we were to increase the size of the Defence Force substantially and to do it swiftly and to do it equitably, and we weren't able to do that through reintroducing conscription, surely we need to rethink how we've contracted out the control of recruiting, particularly to the reserves, because there are just still so many problems in the way the contractors are doing it that it's not ideal, particularly compared to the way, for example, that the Army Reserve used to be able to recruit directly. I realise both of you aren't Army officers, so you mightn't be familiar with the background. But yeah, you've got to fight your way into the reserve in many ways now.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not familiar with this. I know that there's been a lot of conversations about the performance of our defence recruiting contract. Again, you've got some speakers coming on later today that will be able to talk very specifically to that and the efforts that are underway in defence to remediate that. It's not part of my routine business to deal with that issue. Mick might have something there from a mobilisation perspective, but there's not much I can offer really.
Michael?
Thanks, Neil. I can't speak to the mechanics of a contracting process or what drives that. I can speak to the product. And the great thing about developing a concept is it's novel ideas and doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be adopted. But to deal with mobilisation, one of the factors we have to deal with is scale, and specifically agility, inability to rapidly scale up, scale down, or modify our structure far more quickly than we have in the past. So I expect it will be one of the things we'll dig deeper into to at least throw up ideas of what it could look like and what a requirement could look like, which will then subsequently be an outcome of interest to our recruiting, both of permanent and reserves potentially. And we've got many phases of experimentation to go before we come up with those more formal ideas.
Okay, to throw one final question into the mix, and that's the old hoary one about conscription and national service. In terms of mobilisation, this was last looked at in 1989 when the then Labor government wanted to deploy a brigade group into Cambodia, and when the cabinet submission said that the ADF wouldn't be able to sustain it unless we introduced conscription, the idea of the brigade group evaporated almost instantaneously. But has any thought on the mobilisation side been given to the fact that if the international situation deteriorated, then we'd have to think really seriously about some form of conscription again? The problem there, of course, is under modern legislation, it would have to not take into account gender distinctions, and we'd be recruiting or conscripting reasonably large numbers of young Australian men and women every year, and there'd have to be some form of alternative to Defence Reserve Service, as there was with the 1960s conscription scheme. Has any thought been going into this just as an option in the future if we needed it?
Again, none that I'm familiar with there. I'm sorry, Neil, I can't shed any light on that issue.
Michael?
From a conceptual point of view, we're looking at many different ideas. Concurrency is one of the factors which we're considering. That is, how do you use people potentially in multiple areas for different tasks? But our existing planning and processes are all based on having a highly qualified, skilled, voluntary, permanent and reserve force. And our present line of work is, if we have to expand a voluntary force, what type of implications that could have. As an example, the capacity of our training organisation. If we wanted to bring more volunteers in, what would that look like? And understanding that element gives us a good benchmark, at least on a voluntary force, to see what we could do within certain timescales to reach certain scalable opportunities, and then help us think about the concurrency aspect of what are the most appropriate forces to put in the most appropriate place to achieve the government outcomes.
It's worth noting that the Defence Act still allows for conscription in war or apprehended war, but it's also, getting back to the point before about talking to the historians, it's worth noting that in 1963-64, the reason we got the conscription scheme was essentially driven by Treasury, because they didn't want to raise the conditions of service of the Defence Force to attract people in a full labour market. And when they did the economic studies at the end of the conscription period, they found that it had actually cost more than it would have done by increasing the conditions of service for the Defence Force in the first place. So I commend to you some of these historical studies, because there's some really great lessons in them of when you have to increase the size of the force quickly and equitably. And basically the only way to do that is some form of national service, but it's always intensely political and culturally controversial. I think we've run out of questions, Paul.
Thank you very much, Neil. To Air Vice Marshal Chipman and to Commodore Turner, thank you very much for pointing out the important role that the Military Strategic Commitments Division and the Force Exploration section of the Force Design Division are undertaking in relation to the really significant issue of mobilisation, particularly in light of our strategic environment. Can I make some comments that in reaching out, I still think there's a failure by Defence Central to really reach out to the external stakeholders that are not necessarily on the defence network in relation to the important work that both groups are doing. For example, when the bill was put forward to Parliament in relation to the streamlining of the calling out of the reserves, no one from Defence contacted the Defence Reserve Association. And in fact, we were contacted by the Shadow Minister for the Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence Personnel. The submissions that were made by both the ADA and by the Defence Reserve Association, I think went some way to convincing the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee of the merits of that particular bill. Likewise, in relation to the key issue of mobilisation, the Defence Reserve Association is very important, is an important stakeholder, and we've had absolutely, well, virtually no consultation to date. And I point out other organisations like the Royal United Services institutions around Australia also have a key role to play in relation to mobilisation. So I just think there is a need for people in Canberra to think broader than just the Canberra community when it comes to the consultation exercise. So can I thank you both for your presentations this morning. I understand that things are very difficult in Canberra at the moment in headquarters ADF, and I do appreciate the time that you've been able to make available to the audience of this conference.